everybody. Everybody's got a cookie. We're all ready to roll. You're an incredibly timely and well-behaved lot. We must have done this a couple times before. So it is my pleasure to introduce Angee Doerr, who is Oregon Sea Grant and Oregon State University's Extension Specialist for Lincoln County, which is where we are. She focuses on commercial fisheries and marine coastal resources, providing community outreach and education on subjects ranging from marine resource management to nearshore energy and sustainable economic growth for coastal industries. Angee works closely with community partners, including commercial fishermen, managers, researchers, to advance our understanding of fisheries and other marine resources in Oregon. She holds a BS and MBA and PhD focused in socially and ecologically sustainable fisheries, or SES, right? Yes. Angee is currently a commander in the U.S. Navy Reserves, having spent 8 years on active duty as a naval flight officer and 9 years in the reserves as officer in charge of a variety of units. And she confessed to me that she can fly an airplane.
I confessed to you that I previously could fly an airplane. It was a long time ago. I don't think you want me flying you around at this point in time.
So welcome, Angee. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to wander a bit. Hopefully this thing has reach. And my green light's on, so we should be good to go. So I'll start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. I've been in this position for about 3 months now. And I was asked to give this talk basically to introduce myself and my background and what I hope to do here. So this isn't really going to be a talk about my current research, or it's not going to be filled with a lot of data. It's basically a talk about who I am, why I'm in this position, and how I see this position evolving with me in it. As an intro, I wanted to give you kind of the big picture idea of what this position is and what my role here in Oregon is. So I seem to be very attracted to positions with very long titles, and this is no exception. My full professional title here is Assistant Professor of Practice, Commercial Fisheries and Marine Resources Community Educator. So it's a joint position with OSU and Oregon Sea Grant, and I wanted to have a photo to exemplify that. I like to just basically do pictures instead of words. And I took about 47 selfies with my extension service jacket with my Sea Grant hat, and that was the best I got, so that's what we settled with. And this position was basically developed by committee, and because of that, this position, my position description is 9 pages long, and it has input from a variety of stakeholders, everything from commercial fishing to other researchers to management agencies and everyone else. But at the end, what it boils down to in those 9 pages is that my responsibilities here at OSU are about 80% extension, teaching, outreach, and engagement, 15% scholarship and creative activity, 5% organizational accountability and service. That 5% is the easiest. It basically means I have to stay within my budgets, I have to turn in my reports when they're due, I have to fill out any necessary paperwork. That 15% is more traditional academia. I have to write papers, I have to present at conferences, I have to give lectures. But that 80% is really, obviously, the meat of my position, and it's the most interesting part. Clearly, I wasn't going to give you guys 6 pages worth of what that position is. But I did want to highlight some of the kind of key areas and what I think makes this position so interesting and made me so excited to come up here and start working. So a big part of what I am here to do is develop, integrate, apply, and disseminate existing or new research-based knowledge. And what that means, kind of in plain talk, is that a big part of what my job is to work with the entire community, with a variety of stakeholders, to work with fishermen, to work with agencies, to work with researchers, to make sure that there's a two-way flow of information. That if someone at OSU has come up with something really, really neat, a new technology, a new way of doing things that's going to make life better for fishermen out on the water, then part of my job is to make sure that information gets out there to the fishermen. Conversely, let's say there's a fishing community, there's people out there that have a really good idea about how they can say, decrease the likelihood of whale entanglements. And they really want to get that information to researchers so that they can actually see if their idea would work. Part of my role is to make sure those conversations happen. To be a facilitator, to be a liaison, to be a communicator, and to help nurture relationships between all these different aspects here in the community. The other thing is to design, coordinate, deliver, and evaluate community education programs. And that's a really neat part and something that's unique to Extension Service and Sea Grant. And that part of my job is actually to be an educator for the community. By community, I mean that could be the tourists that come in during the summer, during programs like Shop at the Dock, where we take them to commercial ports and teach them how to buy seafood directly from the fishermen. And it can be town halls, it can be just giving lectures at the local library about what's going on in the commercial fishing industry. It can be all sorts of things, but it's providing knowledge about our marine resources to everyone that's in the county. Okay. Also, using along those same lines, taking that knowledge and using it to make sure we're really fostering sustainability, both within the fishing industry itself, but in the community as well, which is what I'm going to be focusing on for most of my talk. So I was told that the Sea Grant summer scholars were going to be here, and that there's a lot of undergrads here during the summer, and that I should spend a decent amount of my talk really talking about kind of my career pathway, or as I like to call it, the long, strange path to here. So a lot of people, myself included, when you're younger, when you're an undergrad, when you're in high school and you're thinking about the future, you spend your whole life basically being like, well, what do I want to be when I grow up? And then you go off to college and suddenly you have to decide, right? You have to come up with a major and you have to set this course for your life that's going to dictate the rest of your life. It's daunting, and a lot of people really feel like they can really mess it up, that they've got to come up with this one solution, that this is it, they're going to start here, they're going to end there, and that's it, that's their life. And every now and then you meet someone who starts in one direction and realize it's not quite for them, and they switch direction, but they get to where they wanted to be. It's not a big change. And then there's people like me, and a lot of my colleagues, and a lot of other people I've worked with before, who did get where they were going, but it was by no means a direct path. It was a little bit this way, and then looping around a little bit, tried this direction for a while, backtracked, headed to where I finally realized I wanted to be, and then got there all the same. And I'm going to kind of walk you through that path and more than just the lines and loops. But I also want to point out that at the end of the day, I don't think there is really just one right path anyways. I think there are lots of different options that would have been equally exciting. But the opportunities that were presented to me and the paths that I chose over my life brought me here, and I'm very glad they did. So I won't start at the very beginning. It would take too long, and I haven't been given that much time. But I'm going to kind of take you back to really how I became a marine scientist in the first place. So when I was a junior in high school, I was in a military family. My dad was in the Air Force, and he got orders to Texas. And so junior in high school, we moved to Texas. I'm starting to think about colleges, right? I don't know anything except for that I don't really want to stay in Texas. Nothing against it. I just wasn't my dream location. I was a 18-year-old girl, 17 to 18 when I was applying, and I knew I wanted to be far away from my parents. So that meant, one of the coasts, because that's about as far away as I imagined I could get when I was going to college. And I had spent quite a bit of time on the East Coast growing up, and so I knew I was comfortable with the East Coast. I liked it. I also had lived in a lot of cold places growing up, and after having lived in Texas for about a year, knew I did not want to go back to the cold. So really my criteria was East Coast, not cold. And so I went on a college trip with my dad, and we started touring colleges, and we basically focused Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. And I visited Duke, and over the course of a day and a half, I decided that was it. That was where I was going to go. Applied early admission, and I got in, and I went off. Only school I applied to. I only visited like 4 schools. I mean, I was very set in my ways as a teenager, still am to a certain extent. And I went off to Duke knowing very little about it, knowing very little about North Carolina, and what I might encounter there. And I was in for quite a bit of culture shock. It took me a while to really understand. It was my first time encountering so-called coastal elites. There are a lot of people from New York City, wealthy people from New York, wealthy people from California that go to Duke, a lot of wealthy people in general, and also, very southern school. So it took me a while to fit in, and I did really enjoy my time there, but it was so bizarre and foreign to me that I really kind of wanted to experience something else as well. And so I decided I was going to study abroad. I went to Duke on a military scholarship. That's how I paid for it. And so most of my elective time was taken up with Navy stuff. And so didn't have a foreign language. I knew I wanted to study abroad. I knew I wanted to go someplace fun, and I needed to be able to speak English there. So that pretty clearly and narrowly directed me towards Australia. So the program I was doing at Duke, Environmental Science, had an exchange program with James Cook University in Australia, which is a fantastic place. I know lots of people have been there. If you haven't, it's great. It's in Townsville, Australia. And doing my research on Australia, I did not realize quite how large of a continent it was. It looks so small. It's really about the same size as the United States. And all I knew is that along the eastern coast of Australia, there was some really good surfing, and I was going to be on the eastern coast of Australia. And so I get to Townsville, Australia, and I go to the beach. Literally, first day there, they took the international students, and they take us on a tour of Townsville, and they take us to the beach. And there are no waves. No waves. And I turned to one of the Australians, and I'm like, how do people surf here? There are no waves. And they look at me like I'm an idiot, which I was. And they told me, well, there's no waves here because of the Great Barrier Reef. Never had heard of a Great Barrier Reef. No idea what one was. Quickly learned, largest Great Barrier Reef in the world, beautiful coral reef system. And so when I was trying to figure out what people did instead of surfing, I found out that people went scuba diving. At this point in my life, I was an Air Force brat. I'd grown up on Air Force bases in interior America. I spent some time on the Chesapeake Bay. That was about it. I think I'd been snorkeling twice before in my entire life. But I was like, well, I'm here. I might as well learn to scuba dive. And I got together a couple of the other international students, and we went and got our open water certification. And I fell in love. It was just amazing. To be fair, I was learning on the Great Barrier Reef. So, it's hard not to, but I just fell in love. And I worked some gray area connections with a dive company. I was a foreign student, so they couldn't actually employ me, but they would let me work on the dive vessel, taking care of gear, refilling tanks, things like that. For their dive cruises in exchange, they would teach me or take me on dive tours, or underwater dives. So got a lot of wreck dives and night dives, got my advanced dive certification, came back to Duke and suddenly wanted to go in a new direction. I was already doing environmental science focused on biology and animal behavior, but prior to that I hadn't even considered anything marine. And I came back and I immediately knew that I needed to get out to Duke's Marine Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina. So much like the undergrads here, I went out and spent a summer at the Marine Lab, Beaufort. And during the course of the summer session there, you had two classes, one that everyone had to take and one that you got to choose. The one I got to choose, because I was interested in animal behavior, was one on marine mammals. And for that class, I basically spent the summer on small boats, taking photos of bottlenose dolphins. Pretty fantastic, nice way to spend the summer. Studying sound patterns and looking to see if you could identify dolphins via calls, things like that. But the other class, the one that everyone had to take, was a lecture-style class with some field trips built in, and it was on the ocean coast and policy, basically, the North Carolina coast and policy. And it was joint led by a marine biologist, Larry Crowder, and anthropologist, sociologist, Mike Orbach. And they would teach, lecture styles about how you needed to think about the human dimensions as well as natural dimensions of systems, and then they would take us on field trips to show us what they meant. We went and talked to commercial fishermen, and they talked to us about how policy and management decisions really impacted their lives. We went to seafood processing plants, and they talked to us about, how changing population demographics were making it really hard for them to find workers because people were leaving small towns, things like that. And how even then fish, a lot of it was being exported for processing. We went and visited coastal communities and looked at how coastal erosion and sea level rise was already impacting some of those coastal communities, and talked about public trust and access to beaches and things like that. And it was the first time in my life that I really got excited about these connections within a system and thinking about a system as a whole, thinking about the humans as well as the natural side. And I knew that at some point in my life I wanted to pursue it. But unfortunately, this was shortly before I graduated. And the day after I graduated, I got commissioned in the Navy. While I was at Duke, I spent my summers on Navy boats, sailing around the world, and I learned one very important truth about myself, which is that I really like being on boats for short periods of time. So being in the Navy, realizing I didn't really want to be on a boat, it turns out the only real good solution for me was land-based aviation, which was a really fun solution. I got to travel all over the world, and instead of staying in boats, I got to stay in hotels, and we got paid per diem. So we get called the per diem Navy. They say it as an insult, but we see it as kind of bragging rights. We would make way more money than they do on the boats. And we got to travel, we got to fly all over the world on this porcupine here. Because of the way this plane operates, we're not flying super high, 20,000 feet or so. And when you're flying over, especially on a clear day, the land below you is laid out just like a patchwork. I mean, it's so easy to identify natural areas, small towns, big cities, and seeing this stark contrast between like the natural areas and developed areas, and living and traveling all over the world and seeing how poorly we were taking care of the planet in most of the places that we went to, really made me concerned and interested and gave me kind of a drive to figure out what I could do to help what was going on, what I was seeing happening all over the world, not just in our own country, but in every country I visited. And so when I finished at the squadron, I went to a shore tour. Basically what happens in the Navy is you go out and you do something active on a ship or on a squadron, and then they put you behind a desk for a couple of years, and then you go out and you do the fun stuff again. And so when I was sitting behind the desk, the command I was at had an educational program, and they offered me an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration. At no point in my life had I ever thought that I wanted an MBA. I didn't see any reason for it. But one thing I have learned and continue to learn all the time is always say yes to an opportunity when it's presented to you. There's no reason to turn down free education. There was certainly no reason to turn down a free MBA, so I said yes. And I got to pick my own focus area, my own major, if you will. So I focused on entrepreneurship. And as part of that, I had to basically research, design, build an entire business plan. And so I focused on ecotourism. And because I chose my business was an ecotourism business, I got to choose the classes that complemented that. So I got to take a lot of things about environmental law, business law, finance, marketing. And I realized I liked the social sciences far more than I ever guessed I would, especially marketing, which is basically how you trick people into buying things. It's fascinating. And I realized how much I missed learning. And so at this point, I had been in the Navy about 7.5 years. My commitment to the Navy was up. I was ready. It was time for me to kind of go on my next stage, which is a sea tour, where they were going to send me on a boat for long periods of time because it is a requirement eventually to stay in the Navy. And I did not really want to do that, so I decided I would apply to grad schools. I had no idea what my chances were, but I figured I'd apply, and if I got in, I would go to grad school, and if I didn't, I'd figure out, what I was going to do in the Navy. And so I applied to a couple different grad schools, went out and visited, and really fell in love with UC Davis. It's a University of California, Davis. Prior to applying to grad school, I'd never actually even heard of UC Davis. I was applying to places like UC Berkeley and UC Santa Barbara, and UC Davis kept popping up on all these lists, and so I started digging into it. Turns out it's a really fantastic ecology program, probably one of the best in the country. And in talking to professors at all these different universities, I really clicked with one here, Jim Sankirko, who was a resource economist, but having just finished this MBA, I knew that I really wanted to incorporate some of this social science into my degree. So he was a resource economist working in an ecology program, which was a perfect fit for me. And so I went off to UC Davis, graduate group of ecology, working with a resource economist, working with an environmental policy person, cultural anthropologist. I mean, very interdisciplinary program. And my advisor, Jim, was working in the Bahamas. Most of his research was in the Bahamas. So I signed myself up for that and came up with a research program looking at marine protected areas in the Bahamas. I went off, did some research, did some coral reef surveys, things like that, And while I was there, I met up with some scientists that were working on the spiny lobster fishery in the Bahamas. So the main exports, or the main industry in the Bahamas, you have international banking, you have tourism, and you have commercial fishing. And commercial fishing is almost exclusively the spiny lobster. And the Bahamas wanted to apply for Marine Stewardship Council certification, MSC certification, or sustainability certification. But in order to get that certification, you have to have data. You have to be able to show that the population is healthy, that the fishing methods that you're using are sustainable, that there's not excessive amounts of bycatch, things like that. And while everyone kind of agreed that all of those things were true, there just wasn't the data to back it up. The Bahamas is still a developing country. It only has about 350,000 people. That's spread across a vast amount of space. It didn't have the money. It didn't have the people. It didn't have the gear to collect all this data. So they were bringing in researchers, and they asked me if I could help out with this project. And I said, sure. It could be a little side project. It sounded interesting. And the more I dug into this issue of the spiny lobster fishery and the fishermen that were associated with it, the more I realized that this was just a fascinating system. And I'm going to go into it in a little more detail in a second, so I won't spend too much time on it now. But I fell in love with fisheries. I went there to study marine protected areas, and I fell in love with fisheries and the challenges, the social challenges that go along with them. And ended up spending the rest of my time there on this. And as I'm working on this fishery, and I'm working with the fishermen, trying to come up with policies and regulations that I can provide as recommendations to the government of the Bahamas, I realized that, at this point I've studied multiple fields, I have a lot of practical experience, but I had no idea what happens after a scientist gives a report to a government agency. I was like, it just disappears, and then hopefully something good happens. And so I realized I really needed to understand that a little bit more. So I started applying for different science policy fellowships. And ended up doing the California, again, long titles, jobs with long titles, California Council on Science and Technology, Science Technology Policy Fellowship. And I got placed with the California Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, where I basically served as a committee consultant. And I spent a year embedded in the committee, working directly with Senator Fran Pavley on ocean issues and on anything natural resource and water related, which in California, water is a huge deal. So I did tons of work on groundwater, did things on hunting and fishing licenses, all sorts of different bills, and really got an idea of how science gets used in policy, which, long story short, it doesn't. So it was a little bit of an eye-opener, and made me realize that if you want your science to reach policymakers, you have to make it as accessible and digestible as possible. They are not pouring through journals for the vast majority. They don't have the time, they don't have the energy, they don't have the access. Everything's behind paywalls. And so, putting things out there in white papers, making it accessible, putting your name out there is really the best way to make sure that your science actually gets used. And that was only a year-long fellowship, and as it wrapped up, and I should mention, so it's a PhD level fellowship, and so these are all PhD level scientists, and the whole idea behind it is that you take, and other states are starting to copy it, or model programs similar to it, is that you take PhD level scientists and you put them directly in the legislature, and you help them to learn about policy, but you also provide them a science perspective to what's going on in the state legislature. And so it's a really neat program. They're on their 10th year now. And a lot of them end up actually staying because it's actually really fun to work in politics. But I stayed for a year, and I knew I wanted to continue to do science and policy, but I wanted to do it more kind of in a science-facing field rather than policy. And so I moved to Stanford, and I worked for Stanford's Center for Ocean Solutions as a research scientist, and my title there was Research Associate for Coupled Human Natural Systems. And my entire job there was really to make sure we were talking about people whenever we were talking about the ocean. And I did quite a bit of work looking at ocean data science. There's huge amounts of data that are collected every day on the oceans. And there's a lot of people that are trying to figure out how to use that and how to use that effectively, merge it together to help inform management, do things like dynamic ocean management, other things like that, so that we can make management and regulations more proactive rather than simply reactive, and oftentimes reactive years later. And so did a lot of things with ocean data science. I worked with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop a stakeholder engagement decision support tool that can actually be used for a variety of different issues. Basically, you enter in what resource you're talking about, characteristics of the stakeholders themselves. You put in information about how much time, money, et cetera, resources you have, and then you get back based on an algorithm that goes behind the scene that was based on a lot of data. You get back basically suggestions about how best to engage with your stakeholders depending on the circumstances. And for the last year and a half I was there, I was doing quite a bit of work on the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. Sadly, I did most of that work from behind a computer in California, which is one of the reasons I had moved on. But when I did actually make it out to Palau to work directly on the project, it's a beautiful country, and I'm very glad I got to go. But I realized that most of the work I was doing at Stanford was sitting behind a computer, and I really missed doing that hands-on work that I'd done for my dissertation, that I had done with the policy fellowship. I really missed working directly with stakeholders and hearing directly from people and going out, being able to walk out on a dock and talk to fishermen. And so I started looking for kind of what was next, and this job opened up. And as I showed you at the beginning with the position description, it literally ticked every single box I was looking for. And allowed me to do what I like to do best, which is work on fisheries as social ecological systems. So this is just kind of one of the most common figures for social ecological systems, Eleanor Ostrom. And I use it because it is so well known, it is so simple. And the idea behind social ecological systems is lots of times when we think about, say, fisheries, we think about the fish, the resource units, or we think about the fishermen, the resource users. And for a long time when we managed fisheries, we managed just for, the fishermen. It was go out, catch what you can, or go out and catch the maximum amount possible, and let's hope nothing bad happens. And slowly, as we've added more science and more knowledge into things like Magnuson-Stevens, we've evolved it to really consider fisheries as these social ecological systems, with the idea that at any point the resource system itself could change. You have El Nino cycles, you have shifting levels, shifting pH, shifting sea surface temperatures, salinity. All those things are affecting the physical environment. That affects the resource itself. Same thing if you're overcatching this resource. This resource might have huge increases in numbers, it might have huge decreases. These things are all connected. That obviously impacts the resource users. They have good catch years, they have bad catch years. And the governance system's also very tightly related to all of this. Any changes they make or any changes that are impacting them affect the entire system. And unless you are looking to manage that system as a whole, you're missing the point. You're missing the big picture. And also equally important, you have this social, economic, and political settings. Things like the community itself. Fisheries can't exist without a supportive community. An area like Newport, if the city of Newport suddenly decided that they no longer wanted the active working waterfront, and they no longer wanted commercial fisheries here, they can make it a really difficult place to live. One of the beautiful things about Newport is that the commercial fisheries are so supported by the community, and they're such an integral part of the community. And other places in the U.S. where we've seen that fisheries get pushed out to make way for things like tourism and things like that. So the system all has to kind of work together in order to continue to function. And I'm going to kind of talk you through briefly a couple of examples. And at any point if you have questions, feel free to stop me, because I don't have like a script here. You can just jump in and I'll be able to pick up where I'm going. So the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, what I mentioned that for about a year and a half I was working with the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions. I was working with the Palau National Government on the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. With the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, basically the current president, when he ran for office in 2015, he ran on the idea that he was going to basically turn Palau into the world's largest marine sanctuary. He was going to take 80% of the EEZ and turn it into a sanctuary and leave 20% open for fishing and use. And that's what he ran on and wrote it into law, and it's going to be implemented in January of 2020. Sometime in 2018 or so, when it really started to dawn on the government of Palau that this was really happening and this was coming up soon, they realized that they needed a plan in place to make sure that it was a success. Because what Palau prides itself on its marine conservation, and they really want this to be an example initially for other Pacific Island countries and territories, but eventually for the world, to show that something like this is possible. So they wanted to be able to show that it was, ecologically successful, but that it was also socially and culturally and politically successful. And so they brought Center for Ocean Solutions on because the Center for Ocean Solutions ideology or methodology is that we basically take things from challenge to solution along this whole knowledge to action spectrum. We identify the issue, we identify what data needs to be collected to work on that issue. We collect the data or work with people that collect the data, analyze the data, provide solutions. The idea with Center for Ocean Solutions is we are interdisciplinary and we work along this entire spectrum. And so they brought us in to help them kind of attack the social aspects as well as the cultural, as well as the ecological aspects of creating an EEZ this large and looking at some of the long-term impacts and how to manage or how to monitor to see what was working and what wasn't working and how could they adapt it over time. And so my job with the Palau National Marine Sanctuary was, most of the people that were working at it were looking at kind of ecological monitoring. How do we monitor to make sure it's got these ecological impacts? And a lot of what I was doing is saying, okay, but what are the cultural impacts? Because for the Palauan people, very few of them are full-time commercial fishermen, but they're basically all part-time fishermen. They go out, they go fishing, they get off work in the afternoon, they go and they catch some fish, they bring them home. Almost everything they eat in terms of seafood are local reef fish. So the government of Palau was doing two things that almost seemed contradictory at the same time, which is what I was working on. They are trying to get people to no longer collect reef fish and to collect pelagics instead. At the same time, they are shutting off the vast majority of the pelagic waters. And the only waters that are still available for fishing are the territorial seas around the inhabited islands, which are lots of times are nearshore reef systems, and then kind of this bit. And I will say almost everyone lives in this bit. There are a few people that live here, but almost everyone lives here. And so they're trying to do two things. They're trying to change the culture in terms of getting fishermen to go for pelagic versus reef. Also trying to very much narrow the options of where they can collect those fish. And so really the only way to do that successfully is to work directly with the local population, understand fishing behaviors, understand what you can do to change fishing behaviors, understand what they need to see in this in order to be for it to be successful and enforced, because monitoring and enforcement is very difficult in places like this. And really come up with metrics to measure. It's somewhat easy to measure the economic impact, but to measure the social and cultural impacts can be quite a bit more difficult. And so coming up with metrics of well-being and things like that, really so that you can understand the system as a whole. Obviously ecological as well, looking at whether or not this was shifting more pressure onto the reefs because so much of the pelagic seas were shut off, which was the exact opposite of what we wanted. Or people really were shifting efforts. And I didn't actually check to see if sound works on this, but if it does, I have some quotes in here. But the other thing, as I mentioned, I did my dissertation work in the Bahamas on the lobster fishery, and this is a fascinating social ecological system. So the fishermen are building these condos. They're just basically 2x6s, corrugated sheet metal. They put them on seagrass floors, put a cinder block on top of them, and then they leave them forever. And if you're interested at some point in the future, I've got a million pictures of these slowly just disintegrating over time because they just leave them there forever. They're not traps in the traditional sense. Lobster and other fish can come and go as they please, but because they mimic the lobster's natural habitat, and because they're large and low and dark, lobsters really like to aggregate in them, and they'll aggregate in them in a very large number. The fishermen know where they are, so they can go to these condos and find the lobster in very large number and much more rapidly and more easily collect them. And so they're just a really good aggregation tool. And once you actually put them in the water, you get sediment that on top of them, you'll get microalgae, the seagrass, little fish will use them. There's the lobster, really large here, hanging out there. But lots of different things will use them. They basically become part of the system, and they have a lot of positive impacts. They provide shelter. They're really great for juveniles of all different species. But at the same time, they're allowing fishermen to aggregate large numbers of lobsters and collect them easily, as opposed to what they would do traditionally, which would be to find them in coral reefs and collect them in much smaller numbers. On the flip side of that, they're no longer destroying coral to get to the lobster. And so there's a lot of pros and cons, but the main issue with these condos is that they're unlicensed, unmarked, unregulated. They don't technically belong to anyone as far as the Bahamian government's concerned. But for the fishermen who build them, they're putting a lot of time and money into building these. They're not buying them like this. They're importing all these materials from the United States. They're building them. They're setting them. And it tends to be the wealthier fishermen with the larger boats that are collecting all of these condos, or that are building all of these condos. And they take them out and they put them all over the Bahamas. And then you have smaller, less wealthy fishermen on smaller boats going out for shorter trips that will come across these condos and collect from them. And so a big part of what I ended up researching there was this social conflict, this contrast. And we'll see if my quotes work or not. I'll just tell you, that was just as a remark. No, it is playing, but it's not going to play loud enough. Okay. Can I turn up? Yeah. Okay. Oh, there we go. Perfect. You ever been involved in a conflict that's come up because of condos?
Involved?
Uh-huh.
You had a long beach time. You would have to be a scientist.
I wish.
Plenty conflicts.
Yeah.
Gunshots fired and everything else. I'm telling you, you have been a bunch of shots.
I see, yeah.
And I ain't scared. They know that I don't back down from it. My son just as did.
Right.
All of my children really, but especially they just like it. Their mother is a calm as anything. They got all that from me.
Yeah.
Yep, my God tells you. They got that from their daddy, not me.
So this is a fishing vessel from Spanish Wells. Spanish Wells is one of the wealthiest islands in the Bahamas. It's also an exclusively white island, which really feeds into this larger level of conflict that happens within the Bahamas. And so these fishermen, they have these large motherships, and then they have smaller dinghies, which are you'll see in the next slide, are just smaller vessels. They have smaller dinghies that travel with the mothership, anywhere from 4 to 6 dinghies. They can go out for weeks at a time. The dinghies go out on their own during the day. They have divers in the water that are collecting from their condos, and then they bring all the lobster back, and they put it basically in the hold. And so they can stay out for extended periods. They're collecting large numbers of lobster from these condos. And because they're the ones putting out the condos, even though they're putting them all over the Bahamas, they consider them to be their personal private property. Just one. Have you ever been involved in any sort of conflict because of condos?
Yeah.
Have you both? Okay. So I'm going to have you both describe for me. So you want to go first?
You can put up on them, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they come and they say, what you gonna do? You're working my condo. Ooh, I'll shoot you, things like that. Conflict sometimes they come with that baseball see if they can run it over you to crack to sink you, do things like that.
And this is, again, all of this is anonymous. I'm not going to be spreading this, but just to get an idea of how this works. When you say they, are you
I'm speaking
Spanish
with,
Wells or?
yes, right, speaking with that. Not the leadership, no, they don't, you don't have that problem. Spanish, they come with that.
Yeah, so he mentioned having guns pulled on him multiple times, and then I don't know if you can tell or if you can understand the accent as well, but he also says they try to run over their boats with their large boats, and I heard that from multiple small fishermen. Even if they were not collecting from condos at the time, if the fishermen from Spanish Wells or Abaco thought that they were in the vicinity of their condos, they would try to run them off or run them over or shoot at them to get them. But what you have to realize is the fishermen from Abaco and Spanish Wells are putting these condos down in the traditional fishing waters, literally less than a mile off the coast of, say, North Andros. And so the fishermen are going out,
There's no submerged lands law. I mean, they're basically creating artificial reefs.
They are, yep. So technically, you're not allowed to create artificial habitats, but because these are in some nebulous gray area of fishing gear, and they're not technically classified as artificial habitats, and they've put down, at this point, probably more than 1 million. So they're there to stay.
I worked in the British Virgin Islands, and they have very strict submerged lands
Yep.
regulations.
No, the Bahamas, it's very hard to monitor, manage, enforce any of these things because so much land, so much water, not a lot of people. And it's hard because, when you're working these systems, you're not taking sides. They both have valid points. They both have understandable frustrations. This is just a real quick graph, and I won't spend much time on this, but as you can see, this is Spanish wells up here. These are condos per dinghy. It's not per mothership, per dinghy, per those small 2 to 3 man boats that go out with the motherships. 6,000 plus per dinghy, and they're catching all of their lobster from condos. They're not doing any. They're not catching any lobster from the traditional systems. Some fishermen still are, especially on some of the smaller islands or more rural islands. But North Central Andros, which is not very far from Spanish Wells and has a lot of condos off the coast of it put by people from Spanish Wells and Anaco, they're this teal or this turquoise, and they're catching almost all of their lobster from condos as well, and they're not putting any out. In fact, sometimes when they find condos, they will move the condo to a new location, and it becomes their condo. And so it's a really interesting conversation about property rights and who do the condos belong to, and if the condos do belong to someone, but the lobster inside the condos don't, because the lobster come and go, right? It's not traditional. It's not a traditional gear in the sense that the lobster aren't trapped in there. So if the lobster are free to come and go, then how can you say it's your lobster when they're in the condo? And so it's just a really interesting social ecological system because the condos are having massive ecological impacts because they've created an entire new network of shelter, structure. Thank you.
These things are small lobsters, very young lobster in the condo.
No, you get big ones as well. Yeah, you get pool size. We saw a really large lobster in there as well. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know the tail distribution when they're shipped out.
Yeah, and you do get all sides. We did a number of underwater surveys, went out to these condos, lifted them up, checked out what was underneath there, and you do get some small ones, you get some very big ones, they all use them. These condos themselves are 8 feet by 6 feet, they're not small. And you can get 50 lobster in that at a time.
With the increase in habitat, has there been a big increase in population, do you think, as well?
So that's part of the question, and that's what they're trying to get the numbers, but there's just not, the data doesn't exist right now.
Sure.
So
That happened before.
Exactly, yes. So, and that's the concern, is on the one hand, it's providing protection for the juveniles, which is good. On the other hand, it's making them a lot easier to catch, which is bad. So, and really briefly, I'm going to talk about market squid. Just because market squid's a neat one for Oregon, because, years like this year, you get quite a few market squid vessels that come up here to Oregon. And it's interesting because even though it's a coastal pelagic species, and technically Pacific Northwest Fisheries Management Council has jurisdiction over it, it's actually regulated at the state level. It's regulated by the state of California, and almost all landings are in the state of California. But the market squid don't necessarily know that they're supposed to stay in California, believe it or not. And so in warm years, they oftentimes come north. And there's still some debate about whether or not they are tracking temperatures or if they're tracking krill productivity. But regardless, in years that, especially following El Nino years, you see crashes in the market squid fishery in California, and you see significant increases in Oregon. And so this is just kind of these track. And so you can see basically El Nino years where sea surface temperature and other factors were above norm, and those same years, basically when things are high, the market squid fishery in California is low, but it's also high in Oregon. And so that creates a really interesting, ongoing, emerging issue here in Oregon, where we're trying to figure out whether or not we're going to start seeing market squid more commonly here in Oregon, if it needs to start being managed here in Oregon, what that means for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, whether or not they'll create some sort of licensing system, a quota system, none of which currently exists in Oregon.
So Oregon currently just defers to California to manage it? Or
No.
Okay.
It basically doesn't get managed in Oregon. There are rules basically that say if more than, 4.5 million tons get landed in Oregon, then they have to come up with a plan. And usually it falls under that. And it has in the past couple of years, it's gone above. But basically there are certain gear restrictions, certain, you can't fish in marine reserves, things like that. But other than that, just doesn't get managed.
I talked to a couple of the squid fishermen, and they said the reason they were up here is to try and develop historic landings for when quotas are given.
Yeah, some of them are. So I've chatted with several fishermen. Some are basically following the squid. Some are just hoping, because the last few years were good. This year was less good, but they were just hoping this year would be good. And then a lot of the Oregonian fishermen have gone out this year trying, with whatever gear they have, trying to land squid, so that if it does end up getting regulated by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they do come up with some sort of quota system that's based on historical landings, that their name's in that pool. And so it creates this incentive to go out and catch squid with whatever means you have, just based on the premise that ocean conditions are changing and that the regulatory agencies will respond, and you want to make sure that if the fishery does end up coming here, that you have your way in. And so it's really kind of all of those aspects of that social ecological system, where we have the changing in ecological conditions, changing resource users potentially, changing governance systems. So it'll be really interesting.
Is that for the actual landings for 2019?
Yes. Well, this is, obviously it's not complete yet. So there's actually, there's a
Two
squid,
boats.
yeah,
There's 2 boats out.
out there right now. So we'll see.
2018 was the big
Yeah,
year.
but yeah,
2019, not
so
as
far.
big.
Mm.
There were
Yeah.
like
2016 was
pretty. Yeah, it was kind of
Yeah.
pretty good too. But
Yeah.
2018 was the biggest year for landings in Oregon.
so. And then just last few minutes, just talking about what I hope to do kind of moving forward here. So as I mentioned, joint position, OSU Extension, and Oregon Sea Grant. And a couple of things that I am working on or will be working on. One thing that I'm really interested in is this idea of growing the fleet, renewing the fleet, reusing the fleet, whatever you want to call it, kind of the countering to this idea that there's a growing of the fleet. The median age of fishermen is in the 50s. There's more fishermen kind of aging out than are coming in, and this is true all over the United States. And one of the issues that comes up is there's no real good training pipeline for people who want to be fishermen. There's no real, there's, up in Astoria, actually there are now continuing or CTE courses in high schools that do talk about fisheries science and fisheries management, but there's nothing locally. There's no reason there couldn't be. Those programs already exist, but they don't exist here. And so there's no courses for young people who want to become a fisherman. And as much as the captains need deckhands, they don't want someone who's never been on a boat before. They don't want someone who can't identify one species from another or who will be a danger to themselves or to the crew. And so coming up with some sort of training program where young people can learn, or older people, anyone who wants, can learn how to identify different fish species, can learn proper navigational techniques, can learn basic fishing boat safety, things like that, so that they can come join a fishing vessel and be safe and be useful to the crew. And these apprenticeship programs actually exist right now in Alaska and Rhode Island, and one is just starting this year in California. And it'd be really interesting to see if we can develop one here in Oregon as well that can help to basically an apprenticeship for young people who want to come and learn the industry. Another program I'm looking at is keeping crews safe, is fishermen safety. So I'm working with some researchers that are already doing these projects so that I can become basically an instructor that can teach fishing first aid. This is just from a 2015 survey they did for the crab fishery. And the idea behind it is that most of the injuries that do occur on vessels, because as we all know from shows like Deadliest Catch, Dungeness Cove, or what was it called here, something like that. Yeah. It's a dangerous job, and there are injuries all the time, and most of those get treated on the vessel, sometimes more successfully than others. And so the more we can do to teach first aid and advanced first aid to fishermen, the more likely we are to have fewer recurring impacts from these injuries. And this is just a video. So this is basically how they pull up crab pots, and this is them doing it in slow motion as a demo for us. So as you can see, there's lots of moving parts, lots of things that you get tangled in, trapped on. And they're doing that, one right after another, moving really quickly. So it moves fast, and that's without any waves or anything else going on. In the daylight, exactly. And finally, the last thing I'm going to be working on, that I know I'm going to be working on, is looking at workforce development for seafood processing. So seafood processing It's an absolutely crucial part of the, the whole commercial fishing industry. And the seafood processors have a hard time recruiting workers, skilled workers. The Pacific Seafood plant up in Astoria, I was chatting with the manager up there. They actually get a large portion of their workforce from the Ukraine. It's actually cheaper for them to bring them here from the Ukraine and then put them up in hotel rooms during peak seasons than it is basically for them to. It's easier for them to do that than to find local workers that will work for the hours and the.
They're putting workers up in a hotel room.
Yep, they have to. So it's a lot of different issues: social issues, economic issues. There's a housing shortage. Trying to pay people a minimum wage to work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week in an area where there's not affordable housing is a very difficult challenge. And so it's just the crab processing. But just because
what makes specific is
Dungeness
that we
is
are
such
able to
an important one
strategically
for us.
put it in the right product form at each location.
It's all decided right there in the beginning, when it's a live crab, before it's cooked.
We are the biggest single processor or crab buyer on the West Coast. If one plant is short, we can truck the crab, or if one plant is heavy on crab, they can truck to a plant that doesn't have as much. So we're very fast.
Yeah, so Oregon is the Dungeness crab capital of the world. We ship all of the United States. We ship about 30% of our product to China. It's a very, very important, economically and culturally important resource. And processing it is incredibly labor and time intensive. And so trying to figure out how we can meet the demand for processors so that we can process more here locally in the community and keep some of that that investment here locally and some of that economic return here locally is a challenge that I'm looking forward to working on.
You're going to have to get a new president.
Yeah. So anyways, that's me, who I am, my background, and my plans for my time here. And so the rest, I guess, is just questions that you have for me.
So now that you're here,
Yeah.
and you've had a chance, I mean, obviously you came with high expectations, right?
Mhm.
You sort of knew what you were getting into. I'm curious how much you like it. I mean, 3 months is a short window.
Yeah.
You know, just general first impressions.
I mean, honestly, I love it. So I've been trying to I was stationed in Whidbey Island for a while in my younger days, and I've been trying to get back to the Pacific Northwest since then. And coming in April, I've been incredibly fortunate. It's been very beautiful. Maybe if I showed up in November, I'd be like, oh. But no, I mean, I love it. The people are friendly. It's a gorgeous place to live. The hardest thing about starting when I started is basically every fishery is open right now. And so I go out and walk the docks, and there's like 7 boats there, right? Everyone's out fishing, which is good. But that's probably been the most challenging thing right now. Is a big part of my job is getting to know the fishing community. So I've had some luck with like Fishermen's Wives Clubs, and it's great that we have organizations like that here. And the fishermen I have met have all been incredibly welcoming. But that's probably been the most challenging part, is getting to know that stakeholder group.
You got them all out, and you got the albacore guys will be going out any day now.
I know.
So the port's going to just be empty.
I know. Yep. So I did a dock walk for some 8 to 10-year-olds the other day, and yeah, I was like, well, there aren't really many boats here, but let me talk to you about 3 that are here. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot working with end users in this position, but also you talked a lot about policy and regulations. How do you imagine this position sort of interacting with ODFW or the environmental DEQ, right, or those other organizations?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. So like when you're talking about seafood processing and things like that, they are the ones that are really interacting with DEQ, and so working as kind of a liaison or facilitator there to understand some of the complications they're having with some of the DEQ requirements versus what, the seafood processors are able to do with the facilities that they have and the money that they have. But with ODFW is fantastic, and the nice thing about Newport is my job is really easy because all these groups already work together, and I guess my job is just not to mess that up. But a really good example of that would be like the Whale Entanglement Working Group. So as you guys probably know, there was a lawsuit brought by Center for Biological Diversity that brought against brought against California, looking at whale entanglements and fishing gear. A lot of that is Dungeness crab gear, although it's other fishing gear as well. And basically, California lost, and they were told, rightfully so, that the fishing presented basically a take risk to endangered humpback whales, and therefore they had to come up with a plan to address that. And so about 2 years ago, commercial crab fishermen, ODFW, Sea Grant, conservation groups, et cetera, kind of all came together and developed a whale entanglement working group that was facilitated by Oregon Sea Grant, but had active participation from ODFW, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and commercial crab fishermen and things like that, to kind of all come together and get ahead of the curve on this problem and saying, we know we're going to have to come up with a solution. What are some things that we can talk about, work through the industry, figure out these things together to get to come up with this plan for what we're going to do when we have to come up with this ITP.
And California had a similar group and had come up with a plan, and then it was just thrown out by the courts or something.
I don't know. It's entirely possible. I'd have to look into that. So we haven't reached that stage yet. And the California, whatever plan they've come up with ITPs hasn't been thrown out by the courts, because that's a long system that occurs, at the agency level.
No, I mean the conservation group won in the court.
Yes.
And basically ignored the working group.
Because California hadn't done enough. They legally, the law is very clear that anytime you're interacting with endangered species, you have to have an ITP, an incidental take permit. And they were saying, well, we're doing all these things. They're like, yeah, but you're not following the letter of the law. And so what the working group here is trying to do is be like, okay, as part of this, coming up with this incidental take permit, you have to have basically a mitigation plan or plans that you're not going to have interactions with the whales. And so that's what the working group is kind of working on.
And that was humpbacks, not grays?
It's different in different states. Here in Oregon, it's usually humpbacks. We have had some grays as well. Yeah.
The endangered species are a couple of populations.
Yes, of humpbacks.
And that's where
Yes.
that's the driving force
Yes.
in this, is that those are endangered species.
The migratory humpbacks are endangered.
And it's the species, the humpbacks that are off of Central California, the ones that go to breed in Mexico and down in Central America. Those are the key populations that are of issue.
Right. So we got like 2 minutes left if anyone else has a question. If not, it's a beautiful day.
So there's a lot of things going on with commercial fisheries and a lot of projects. Which one are you most excited to look into?
Ooh. I'm really, really excited about this idea of this apprenticeship program, this training program, just because I think it can have kind of far-reaching effects. And it's something that multiple fishermen have come up to me and said, we need to figure out a way to get the next generation of fishermen. And so that I think I'm most excited about. But I will say, even with like the fishermen safety, they're sending me to wilderness first responder training for 2 weeks in September. I think that'll be fun, right? So I think all of these projects will be, I think the seafood processing is probably the most challenging, but I think they're all going to be interesting. Okay, thanks.